I jokingly mentioned that I have handouts. Some people would argue, well, you never read handouts before, so you can determine if that's because I'm prepared or lack of prepared, one of the two. But basically, just to run through the handouts, this kind of cover some of the things we're going to talk about today. One is this really nice publication that we have created on irrigation water and salinity as well, and its effects on crop production. It's an 8,000 series pub, so if it runs out before it gets to you, it's free, it's online. All you have to do is download it and print it. So some of the information I'll be talking about today about salinity and water will be coming through here, so you guys have that for availability. The other thing I have, I was actually asked to talk about rootstocks as well as salinity, and it's kind of a little bit of a fact sheet I put together on rootstocks. I had more of these, but somehow somebody got them in my previous talk and they took half of them, so I just found that on the way down. But basically, this is on my website, but it covers kind of the horticultural characteristics and on back the disease characteristics. So if you're planting a new block and you want to know about all the rootstocks that I should say that I'm aware of, and some what we know at this point about the horticultural and disease characteristics, they're on here. Now this isn't stone, this isn't written in stone. I don't know if I would say that all these will be true 5 to 10 years from now. We don't know, but that's why we put in trials and we're working on all these factors we're looking at. So they're there for you guys. Okay, so one of the things that I was asked to talk about was rootstocks and kind of trying to manage new plantings in regards to all the problems that we're facing, especially in this area where we're looking at it. And so when I think of ground over here being converted into almonds, I kind of think more along, and by the way guys, if you have any questions, just interrupt me. I'll interrupt myself plenty, so you guys can feel free to interrupt me as well.
Send those around.
Yeah, you can send these around. There's not very many of them, so only take it if you're only take the rootstock one if you're planting, and I can get you. You can call me and I can get you the other one. So I look at the main concerns over here as being verticillium, salinity, and probably in some cases maybe boron, as well as probably a lot of you guys are looking at vigor and drought tolerance. And so when you think of rootstocks, everybody says, well, what do you choose a rootstock for? And most of you guys are going to say, I'm going to choose a rootstock because I want a big tree and I want to get yield early. Well, I'm going to change that thought. The whole point you choose a rootstock is to really have the best defense against the problems that you're having within your soil. You can compensate for that production and that canopy growth that you see with those more vigorous rootstocks by planting your trees closer together. So don't think of choosing a rootstock for vigor. Think of choosing a rootstock for your defensive characteristics of what you're planting into that ground. So we'll go through those problems one by one. Verticillium. We generally don't consider verticillium enough of a pest to fumigate for. And why? Okay, I should back up. Why do I think verticillium wilt's a problem in this area? Well, a lot of you guys are planting tomatoes, cotton, peppers, and that crop is susceptible to verticillium. So the population is built within the soil, and we tend to plant almond into it. Usually we see verticillium wilt affect almond trees in their second year. You'll see scaffolds kind of wilt and die back around that first hot spell in May. You may see it linger on into the third year, but usually kind of after that, the tree will grow through it. So we typically just let the tree grow through it, show the growing pains, cut off the affected scaffolds, and let the tree finish off to the races. So when we look at verticillium, what we tend to do with our rootstocks, we know that from a trial that Roger Duncan has put in up north, that level rootstocks seem to be more affected by verticillium wilt than other rootstocks. And basically, the more vigorous rootstock we plant, we tend to have more of a tolerance per se to verticillium wilt. So the trees still get affected by verticillium wilt, but it's not affected as bad. So we tend to look more towards kind of those peach almond hybrids, or maybe a vigorous peach like Empyrean 1 to kind of get us around the vert wilt problem. The second problem is root knot nematode. Just like verticillium wilt, verticillium, we tend to see root knot nematode a lot in tomato, cotton, and pepper ground, or solanaceous ground. And it's again because of that species tends to, those crops serve as a host for that species of nematode. Now I should point out that when we talk about nematodes and we talk about resistance, there's 3 major nematodes that we worry about within almonds. It's ring, root knot, and lesion. Generally in this type of ground we don't see a lot of ring nematode, but if you're on a sandy ground, real sandy soil, you're from Atwater, Helmar, Livingston, you'll potentially see ring nematode over there. Stevenson area, Helmar, those areas. So when we think of ring, I'm not going to talk about it today, but all the rootstocks I'm bringing up, unless I exclusively say it tolerates ring, it probably doesn't tolerate ring. That's one of the few nematodes we don't have a lot of options, or few nematodes we don't have a lot of rootstock options for. I say, going back to root knot, and some of you are probably saying, well, why is he bringing up root knot? Well, it's because we get a lot of interest in planting some rootstocks that don't necessarily have resistance to root knot. And those rootstocks include Lovell and Crimson 86, as well as Paramount, but we don't plant a lot of that, you'll see in a minute. But those 2 rootstocks, Lovell is a very traditional rootstock that we tend to plant. It's actually one of the older rootstocks that we have in the state. And it was actually surplanted by Nemagard in the 50s and 60s when we got into our 2nd and 3rd generation orchards because of root knot nematode. So it has susceptibility to root knot. Root knot populations will feed on the roots, they'll form these galls, they'll kill the roots, and basically the tree will stunt with vigor. Sorry, it's a little bit annoying. My own voice is annoying, wow. So Crimson 86 is another one that doesn't carry that. That's becoming a very popular rootstock because of its ability to anchor. Has these very long lateral rooting rootstocks, and it's basically work done up in the Sacramento Valley where they're planting Crimson 86 and not seeing the blowover problems associated with other rootstocks. So keep that in mind. If you're going to be planting those rootstocks, make sure you don't have root knot nematode in your ground. All right, salinity. You guys are going to say this is almost going to be an anti-level talk today. Salinity. This is basically due to our increased reliance on groundwater, our increasing salinity that's coming down our water project, our federal and state water project canals. So dealing with salinity, this is water that's getting pumped onto our block. That's how that salt's getting imported. Again, rootstocks can provide us a little bit of a leg up on the salinity problem. What we found through research is that peach almond hybrids tend to tolerate salinity, higher levels of salinity in the soil than peach rootstocks. The worst of the peach rootstocks appear to be Lovell, as I mentioned, the anti-Lovell talk in some cases. If you look at all the peach almond hybrids, they tend to tolerate salts better. The complex hybrids of Viking and Atlas, Viking appears to be better than Atlas. Of the peaches, Empyrean 1 is better than Nemagard. Nemagard is better than Lovell. And Empyrean 1, I should add, is a bit of a wild card. We're still doing some research on that. So if I were to rank those, I definitely, if you're looking at salt as your major problem that you're facing, I'd be looking towards a peach almond hybrid. You do have issues with those rootstocks with wet feet and Phytophthora, but we can manage that probably through adequate and proper irrigation and get around these salinity problems that we're facing. Or I should say it would buy us more time in trying to manage the salinity problem. Any questions on these rootstocks? Silent crowd. Boy, you guys can really make it easy on me. So the next thing I want to kind of tie in is salinity. And the reason why I'm bringing this up is I think many of you are not blind to the fact that there's a lot of trees starting to show tip burn. In some cases, these trees are showing full leaf burn. It's kind of that bronzing effect that you tend to see on these trees. So you'll look at the orchard, you'll see the leaves bronze over, you'll see that dead tissue forming on the tip of the leaf. Basically what happens is the salt gets picked up by the tree, the water it runs with the water into the leaves, the water evaporates off, the salt stays behind, builds to a concentration, kills the leaves. Now that's what we see, but what's going on behind the scenes and what we don't see is actually much worse. So what I explained was the toxic effects of salt. What we don't tend to see and we don't tend to discuss is more of the osmotic effects. So what actually happens to that tree before we get to that point. So let's reverse this probably about 2 years or at least several irrigation cycles so you can understand what I'm getting at. We have this water. It may have reasonable amounts of salt in it, something that we can tolerate. We'll get to those levels in a minute. We apply that salt to the ground. The trees suck up the water, and how we mentioned those rootstocks, they have a different tolerance or affinity to salt. It actually, that rootstock will exclude the salt. So we pump on this water with salt. The root system picks up the water, leaves the salt behind. So the next week, we irrigate again. We put on water with salt. Tree sucks up the water, leaves the salt behind. So now we have a 2x concentration of salt in that root system. We irrigate 10 times, 12 times, 15 times in a season. We have 15 times the salt in that soil. So as you can see, without leaching out the salt, we're gradually accumulating salt within the root system. At some point, that salt will move into the ground, or into the tree, and into, did I just go off? No. At some point, that will move into the actual root system of the tree, because the level is great. But before we get there, we have this high concentration of salt on the outside. We have a low concentration of salt on the inside. Water will try to move to balance out that solute gradient. And that means it's going to move out of the root. So what the tree has to do, the tree has to then produce solutes in that root in order to keep that osmotic effect in balance. So that means the tree is going to appear to be stressed or water stressed, or it's not going to have the vigor it has, even though it's not showing any type of sodium toxicity. Does that make sense? So you may not see the effects of salt, but the effects of salt are impacting your yield. And that's what I'm trying to get at, why you want to think about these problems, not just by the time you see the burn. By the time you see that burn, you're looking at a 2 to 3 year cleanup problem. Basically, 2 to 3 years to get that cleaned up within that tree. So, how do we work through this situation? What do we do? You're now saying, well, great, Dave, that's wonderful. I have burn on my trees. What do I do now? Well, there's a saying, it's called the solution to pollution is dilution. And probably part of this, why we're seeing this, is because we have lack of rain for the last 3 years, as well as lack of snowpack and low quality water coming up the canal. So let's go to the water, because that's where we're going to have to probably find the solution. So when we look at the water that we want to apply, basically we consider ideal water less than 1 decisiemens per meter. So an EC of less than 1 decisiemens per meter. That's what we want to shoot for. If we have higher than that, we need to apply more water to basically keep moving those salts out of the root system. And you're saying, well, my water's not that good. How am I getting away with it? Well, you're working on borrowed time. I'm just going to put it that way. And I'm not trying to be doom and gloom. I'm just telling you how it is. So when you're looking at that water and you have an EC of 1, and you look over at the next value, the SAR value, which is your sodium absorption ratio, we want to see that at 3 or less. And basically, that's the ratio of sodium to calcium and magnesium. And why that's important is because you can mitigate some of those effects of increasing sodium levels with calcium and magnesium. Basically, you'll lower that SAR value. So if you see yourself increasing over 3, or you're at 4, 5, or 6, you can potentially add calcium to your water to lower that SAR value to get to where you want. So we're talking about monitoring the water. You're going to do that through gypsum or potentially through lime, but we'll get there in a minute. The other thing you're going to be looking at when you get your water analysis is this thing called adjusted SAR. And basically that takes into account the pH of the water. And why that's important is if you're applying a very alkali water, which a lot of our groundwater is out here, you're applying alkaline water to the ground, you're going to change the pH of the soil, which means you're going to precipitate out your calcium. So it gives you basically, that value means it's an estimated true feeling of what that's going to give you to the SAR value. So you're going to see I have an adjusted SAR value of 6, but I have an SAR value of 4.5. So how do I get that adjusted to the real SAR value? Basically, it's breaking down the alkalinity within that water. So you're going to try to acidify that water, bringing it down to a neutral pH. I'm sure Steve Creighton would love to talk to you about acidifying water. I thought I'd throw that in there for you, Steve. So to kind of roll that back around, so now we're looking at our water. We have, 1.5 EC. We have our SAR value adjusted as close as we can to 3 or less. We apply this to the ground. We're still applying salts. So basically, if we want our soil to be the same EC of what our water is, this is what you guys are going to kill me. You're going to throw rocks at me up here. You have to apply 33% more water. So we talked about the solution to pollution is dilution. That's what that 33% is what we call our leaching fraction. So to get that, we're going to basically increase our sets 33, make our run times 33% longer. So this is why we're seeing these issues. You're kind of getting at what I'm eventually going to is lack of winter rains, low quality water, and in some cases reduced quantity of water. We don't have the ability to leach with winter rains. We don't have the ability to apply more water because we don't have the quantity to apply, and we're applying lower quality water while we're at it. So this is why we're seeing these salt issues pop up. So not to be all doom and gloom, but let's talk about management first. And then I'll go to questions and I'll be done. So research has shown that as we, for every decisiemens per meter over 1.5, let me start over. If we pull a soil profile 1 through 5 feet and we average the salinity within our rooting profile of our tree, for every decisiemens over 1.5, we'll see an 18 to 20% reduction in crop. So in yield. So that means if we're sitting around 2 to 2.5 decisiemens per meter average root zone salinity, we should expect around a 15 or 18 to 20% decrease in yield. Now that work was done on peach rootstocks. We think the peach almond hybrids might get us a little bit more, maybe 12, 15%, but it's still going to impact the way the tree grows. So that's one thing we need to know. You need to know what you're working with. So I would highly recommend that if you are dealing with applying salty water, that you go through and you perform an adequate soil survey this year. Basically, you're going to be pulling samples from your blocks based on soil type, based on the field, and you can either pull 1 through 5 feet at 1 foot increments or 18-inch increments. It doesn't matter, but you want to pull very similar depth profiles, so that same level, so 12 inches or 18 inches or whatever. You just want to make sure you're pulling the same, increments as you go down in depth. You're going to get those values back. You're going to average your root system. That's going to give you your average salinity for that root system. And this handout talks a little bit about how we can determine how much water it takes in order to leach out some of that salt. Okay, so we get our values back. We're at 1.8 average root system salinity. That's not where we want to be. So we're going to say, okay, Dave, I'm going to implement a leaching program this winter. Because that's basically what we're going to try to do. Is we have this salt in the root system. We have it affecting our trees. If we know that if we try to apply a leaching program in the middle of summer, it's really difficult because these trees are using a tremendous amount of water, and we can't apply more water than basically what the tree's going to use. So we're going to move this leaching program into the winter. Now, many of you are familiar with leaching programs, and I'm going to provide a little bit of a critique. You started too late. Starting in late January is not the time we want to be applying our leaching programs. We don't have enough time. And the other component is that tree becomes active in mid-January. So now we have this root system that's developing, and we're applying water, and we're saturating out the soil roots, the top part of the root system. And now, so we're going to be killing off those fine feeder roots as they begin to germinate prior to bud swell. So basically, take that idea of a leaching program and let's move it up a month. Up a month. So what I've been suggesting is we come to the Almond conference this year and we haven't received enough rain to fill your profile. Apply what you can to fill your profile. And then so now we're sitting on 4 to 5 inches of water on this heavier soil out here. We have the profile filled down to 5 or 6 feet. And then any rain that hopefully will come around the Almond conference will fill that, will help us with our leaching. Your next question is, say, Dave, you're crazy. You're going to have me apply salty water to my field when you're telling me the salty water is the reason why I have the salt problem. Well, you have to remember, as you apply that water and the tree sucks off and leaves the salt behind, the concentration of salt in your soil is higher than what's in your water. So fill that profile with that water, get it down to 5 or 6 feet. Hopefully we get some rain behind that to start chasing and washing out some cleaner water to wash out that profile. If no rain comes around within the next 2 weeks of filling that, so 2 weeks after the Almond Board Conference, go out there and run a relatively long 12 to 18 hour set to get more water on there and begin the leaching program yourself. Come back in about a week later, so you want to let all that water drain off. Let all that water drain off, come back through, and apply the water again. We call this an episodic irrigation event. We're basically going to apply water, let it drain, let the gravity pull through, apply water again, let it drain, apply water again. You want some time in between. You don't just want to run out there and run 72 hours of water and try to flush it down. It's not as effective as applying water, letting it go, applying water, letting it go. And that's mainly because when you apply that water, you allow the concentration of salt that's stuck to the soil particle to come into balance with the soil water. So it'll come to equilibrium, you apply more water, and you flush that soil water out. So that's why you want to do those more periodic or episodic type irrigations. Does that make sense? So start early. Don't worry if you still have leaves on your trees, because most likely those trees aren't pulling any water. Because last year, everybody said, well, I have leaves on my tree in December. They're photosynthesizing. You go out there and you rub your hand on it, they fall right off. They're upsized, they just don't have any wind or rain or anything to blow them off the tree. So they want to come off, but nothing's making them come off, so they're going to stay on. Marie's going to talk a little bit about that. So I think that kind of sums it up. So start those leaching programs earlier. Don't go to long irrigation cycles. Do more periodic irrigation or episodic irrigation events. Try to have your leaching program wrapped up by that first 10 days of January. And hopefully we get a little bit of rain. The other component is don't necessarily wait too much on the rain. Because if you're dealing with the salt problem and you have that profile filled, you're going to be able to take advantage of all the rain that falls. If you don't fill your profile, we need 5 inches of rain to even fill our profile. And I don't even know what the seasonal average is out here, but I can tell you it's probably around 6 to 7 inches. Is the seasonal average of rain, in a wet year?
No, it actually should be 10 to 12 inches, and if you have a rain,
yeah, so
if you have a rain season.
Yeah, so 7 to 10 inches.
We just had it 5 inch last year.
Yeah. So if we wait on the rain to begin with, we're not going to be able to leach as much as if we fill it and then have the rain come in on top of it. That rain will serve as that episodic type irrigation event.
But the question I have is there some varieties that are more affected by salt burn than others? Like so I have camels, and it seems like there's some camels, they have a lot of burn. And the tree next to it, the non-boreal, hasn't got anything. So how do I control that, where I have a bunch of trees that are affected and the others look just fine? So
the question is, he's seeing a difference in salt burn amongst varieties. Now, I'll address that. And then how do I manage that within just that one variety? And I'd say you want to manage the whole orchard, because although you're not seeing the burn on the nonpareil, it's feeling the effects of salt without showing signs of it. So the symptoms are probably there with lack of growth and vigor. So we want to make sure, it's just showing more of a, it's with that osmotic effect that I pointed out before. It's not showing the toxicity. The toxicity is basically, it's the difference between, well, I won't say it because I'll get in trouble. But it's like having a beer or a couple beers and trying to operate a piece of equipment, or being sloshed and trying to operate a piece of equipment, being drunk. And that's the difference with that toxicity effect. It's basically the hangover. And I tell people, salt is like asking, these osmotic effects of these salts, to put it in perspective, is like having these trees run a marathon on a hangover. And that's what we're going to be asking them to do next year. And actually, next year is going to be more like having them run a marathon with a hangover after running a marathon with a hangover. So it's going to be a really tough year, and we got to do what we can do to help mitigate the effects of that salt. Now, to address that component of varietal differences, you're going to see your Fritz show burn before anything else, and you're going to see your Carmel show burn before your Nonpareil. Carmel Monterey will burn up before your Nonpareil, and Fritz will be the first. Fritz is your canary in the coal mine. So if you see any burn on that, it's coming on your other varieties. So just keep that as a field observation.
The other thing I have, I see in the more salt burn and the sandy soil, where I got sandy soil, then on a heavier soil. Does that make any difference?
So his question is, I see more salt on the sandier soil than I do on the heavier soil. I should have had you give this talk. You could answer this. You have all the good questions. So we tend to see salt burn first on coarser soils or on lower exchange capacity soils. So that's going to be your sandier soils. And basically, that's because the soil on that sandier ground or low exchange capacity ground can't stick as much sodium to the soil particle. So more sodium stays in the soil water, which means the tree has more exposure to it. So you always see salt burn on Fritz in your sandiest areas. Yeah, so the sandier, I didn't really bring that up, but that's why if you go over to the east side around Atwater and Livingston, you see a tremendous amount of salt water, or salt burn, even though their water is an EC of like 0.8 or 0.9. And so you're like, well, that's great water. Why are they seeing salt burn? It's because of the soil-water combination. You have a little bit of forgiveness on some of this heavier ground out here. You have a finer soil particle which has more exchange sites, which means you can hold more sodium per exchange, per soil particle, can help reduce those impacts on the tree. So you get a little bit longer of a fuse or some buy time here. Any other questions? Good questions.
Well, I mean, the solution is, you're saying, is washing it down. So there's no other chemical thing that you can go apply to it, like sulfur or lime, even you have that stuff that wouldn't help anything. Or acid or anything.
Okay, so yeah, I missed that too. Thanks for you must have my outline. What can we do? Is there any type of things we can apply to the field to help us with our leaching program? Basically, calcium.
So if you already have calcium in the ground.
That's correct. If you have calcium in your ground, then you're looking at trying to break down the alkalinity. So usually, if you have high amounts of calcium in your ground, it's because it's tied up as probably some type of a precipitate, like a lime or a calcium carbonate, calcium bicarbonate. And so you basically can look at applying acid to your ground, but typically I suggest acidifying your water to basically try to acidify the root zone of your tree. So if you're dealing with alkaline ground, you're looking to acidify to free up the calcium. If you're looking at neutral ground, you're applying gypsum to get calcium. If you're looking at acidic ground, you're looking at lime to get your calcium, because the lime will then break down with the acid in the soil. So that's kind of the idea, is getting calcium back into the ground. And calcium works to compete with those exchange sites on that soil particle, and it kicks off the sodium and allows the sodium to get in the soil water and get flushed. That's kind of the idea. Now, you may have some competition with sodium and potassium. I generally suggest people, if you have adequate amounts of potassium in your tree, to apply your potassium after your gypsum, but it's not so much of an issue over here as it is in sandier ground. Any other questions? Oh, other types of products that work. I have not seen a highly replicated trial with a lot of these types of products that reduces salt burn and flushes salt, other than the tried and true agronomic principles. Magnetic water conditioners have shown some impact in Iran, but they're also applying seawater. So their salt concentrations are 12 decisiemens per meter. We have not been able to show that in California conditions. Should highlight that. And that was work done by a group out of UC Davis back in the 1980s, early 1990s. So they looked at the use of that for scaling and trying to decrease the effects of salinity. Any other questions? Yeah, so the question was, if I add gypsum, does it increase the salt problem? And you're right, it will increase that osmotic movement of water. But what it does do is it helps remove sodium, which is eventually the toxic salt. So calcium won't create toxicity symptoms on our tree. What it will do is it actually does a couple things. One, it improves the SAR ratio we talked about. The other component is it helps us kick off the sodium cation on the soil particle into the soil water. The third is that it looks like the research suggests, molecular research suggests that calcium, adequate or high levels of calcium will actually increase the root's tolerance to salt by basically changing membrane permeability. So we think there's an effect there that we're going to be feeling as well. But you are right, going in and just dumping on tons and tons and tons of gypsum will create the same type of osmotic salt problem that we see that we're trying to prevent as we are. So again, in moderation, tends to be better to mix it in with our water so we can get it applied within our wetting zone where we're applying all our salt. But yeah, don't go out and apply 10 tons of it and expect miracles. Yes? So the question is, if you're salt impacted, can 17 or UN32 for your nitrogen source? So it kind of goes back to the question of calcium. I think there's probably value if you're not able to get your calcium onto your ground through gypsum lime or breaking down the acidity in your soil. Can 17 is a source of calcium. I don't think there's any difference between the source of nitrogen, whether you use can or UN32, but you get the added benefit of the calcium with can 17. So that's also a good consideration to make as well, because you're increasing calcium. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, thank you guys. I appreciate your attention.